Some places are abandoned for a reason. Others are abandoned because they are waiting for the right person to uncover what was never truly lost. At exactly 2:17 in the morning, Ranger exploded from his sleep with 3 sharp barks that shattered the silence inside the tiny shack. Ethan Calloway jolted awake beneath a worn army blanket, his pulse already racing before he understood why. The old structure groaned softly around him as a cold wind pressed against the weathered boards. Moonlight slipped through cracks in the walls, painting pale silver lines across the dusty floor. Ranger stood frozen near the center of the room, ears high, amber eyes locked on a single spot beneath the floorboards. The German shepherd released a low rumble deep in his chest, not a warning, but something stranger. Recognition. Ethan pushed himself upright and listened. For a moment, he heard nothing except the distant whisper of pine trees beyond the shack. Then it came, a faint vibration beneath his boots. Soft, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat buried underground. Ranger stepped forward and scratched the floor once. Then again. The shack had cost Ethan $5 at a county auction 3 weeks earlier. Everyone in town had laughed when he bought it. Yet standing there in the cold darkness, watching his dog stare at the trembling boards, Ethan felt something he had not felt in years. The uneasy certainty that his life was about to change. Ethan remained motionless for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the floor while the vibration slowly faded into silence. Ranger did not move. The dog stood rigid beneath the pale moonlight, staring at the same weathered boards as though he could see straight through them. Outside, the wind drifted through the pines that surrounded the property, carrying a low whisper across the hills. It was the kind of sound that made empty places feel alive. Ethan finally stepped forward and knelt beside the spot. His rough hand pressed against the floorboards. Cold wood met his fingertips. Nothing unusual. No movement. No sound. Yet Ranger lowered his head and sniffed the gap between 2 boards with intense focus. The dog released a soft whine before stepping back. Ethan trusted Ranger more than he trusted most people. The shepherd had spent years beside him, through long highways, forgotten campsites, and lonely nights beneath open skies. If Ranger believed something mattered, Ethan paid attention. Still, after several minutes of searching, he found nothing. No loose nails. No damaged planks. No sign that anything unusual existed beneath the shack. Eventually, the exhaustion of the day caught up with him. He returned to his cot, though sleep came slowly. His thoughts drifted through memories of the past few weeks. 3 weeks earlier, he had arrived in Hollow Creek with little more than an aging pickup truck, a toolbox, and Ranger. The town sat between rolling hills and dense forests in northern Montana, a place where everyone seemed to know each other's grandparents. Ethan had not planned to stay. He rarely stayed anywhere. But then he had seen the auction notice posted outside the county office. Most people ignored it. One item on the list had attracted nothing but jokes. A collapsed shack sitting alone on 5 acres at the edge of town. No electricity. No plumbing. No value. During the auction, people laughed openly when bidding stopped at $5. One man even asked if the county would throw in a tetanus shot for free. Ethan had purchased it without hesitation. He was not searching for profit. He simply wanted somewhere quiet enough to hear himself think. The following morning, sunlight poured through the cracks in the walls long before dawn fully reached the valley. Ethan stepped outside carrying a steaming tin cup of coffee. The air smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and approaching autumn. Ranger trotted ahead across the overgrown yard. A blanket of golden grass stretched toward the tree line, where ancient ponderosa pines stood like silent guardians. Beyond them rose low mountains wrapped in morning mist. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. While Ethan worked on repairing a section of the porch railing, a dusty pickup rolled slowly up the gravel road. Behind the wheel sat Walter Briggs, a retired mechanic whose family had lived in Hollow Creek for generations. Walter removed his hat and studied the shack with an expression somewhere between amusement and concern. "You really bought this place," he said. Ethan nodded. "Seems that way." Walter chuckled softly. "Most folks around here would not spend 5 cents on it." He glanced toward the structure. "You know the stories, right?" Ethan looked up. "What stories?" Walter's smile faded. For a moment, the old man seemed unsure whether to continue. Then he leaned against the truck door and looked toward the shack. "People have been avoiding this property for more than 60 years," he said quietly. "Not because of ghosts, Not because of curses. Something stranger. Ethan felt a small knot tighten in his stomach. Ranger suddenly stopped sniffing the grass and lifted his head toward the shack. His ears stood high. His body froze. And before Walter could say another word, a faint sound echoed from somewhere inside the building. 3 slow knocks. Deep beneath the floor. The 3 knocks seemed to linger in the air long after the sound itself had faded. Walter straightened slowly and looked toward the shack without speaking. The morning breeze moved through the tall grass, sending waves of gold across the hillside. Yet everything suddenly felt unnaturally still. Ranger was already moving. The German Shepherd crossed the yard at a quick trot and stopped at the front steps. His ears remained fixed forward. His eyes never left the doorway. Ethan set down his hammer and walked toward him. "Probably old pipes," he said, though the words sounded weak even to himself. Walter shook his head. "There are no pipes in that building." Ethan felt the weight of those words settle heavily in his chest. Together they stepped inside. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. The scent of aged wood and dry earth filled the room. Ranger immediately headed toward the center of the floor and began pacing in a slow circle. Not frantic, not frightened, focused. The way he behaved when tracking something important. Ethan crouched beside him. "What is it, boy?" Ranger lowered his nose to the boards and inhaled deeply. Then he scratched once at a particular spot near the old stone fireplace. Walter watched from behind. "That is where it always happened," he said quietly. Ethan looked up. "What always happened?" The old mechanic hesitated. His weathered face tightened as though he were reopening a memory that had remained closed for decades. "Back in the 1960s, a man named Everett Hale lived here. Kept to himself. Smart fellow. Built things. Fixed things. Folks said he could repair anything with gears." Walter glanced toward the fireplace. One day he vanished. Ethan listened carefully. People disappear all the time. Not like this. Walter's voice dropped lower. His truck was here. His tools were here. His dinner was still sitting on the table. A chill moved through the room despite the warming day outside. Ranger suddenly froze. His entire body became rigid. Ethan followed the dog's gaze toward the stone fireplace. There, just above the mantel, something caught the sunlight. A tiny metal hook protruded from the stone. Strange. Ethan was certain it had not been noticeable before. He stepped closer and brushed away years of dust. The hook appeared connected to a thin metal rod hidden within the masonry. Walter frowned. "I have been inside this shack before. I never saw that." Ethan wrapped his fingers around the hook and pulled gently. Nothing happened. He pulled harder. A faint click echoed somewhere below them. Both men froze. Ranger immediately barked once. The sound bounced through the small room. Then came another noise. Not a knock this time. A soft grinding sound deep beneath the floorboards, as if forgotten machinery had awakened after a very long sleep. Dust drifted from the ceiling beams. The old fireplace trembled almost imperceptibly. Ethan and Walter exchanged a look. Neither spoke. Slowly, impossibly slowly, one section of floor near the fireplace shifted less than an inch. Ranger stepped forward and placed a paw directly on the moving board. His tail remained still. His amber eyes shone with absolute certainty. Whatever had called to him in the darkness was no longer hiding. For several seconds nobody moved. The old shack seemed to be holding its breath. Dust drifted lazily through the shafts of sunlight, while the shifted floorboard remained slightly raised above the others. Ranger stood over it like a sentry guarding a forgotten secret. Ethan slowly knelt beside the opening and ran his fingers along the edge. Hidden beneath decades of dirt, and where was a narrow seam cut with remarkable precision. This had never been part of the original floor. Someone had built it deliberately. Someone who had wanted it to remain invisible. Walter removed his hat and stared in disbelief. "I have lived in Hollow Creek for 73 years, he whispered. Nobody ever mentioned this. Ethan slid the tip of a flat pry bar into the gap. The wood resisted at first. Then, with a deep groan that echoed through the room, the concealed panel lifted another few inches. A stale breath of cool air escaped from below. It carried the scent of stone, metal, and time itself. Ranger immediately lowered his nose toward the opening and inhaled. His tail gave one slow movement. Not fear. Not excitement. Recognition. Ethan carefully raised the panel higher. Beneath it lay a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Walter took an involuntary step backward. The stairs appeared ancient but surprisingly well preserved. Thick wooden beams framed the entrance, and every surface bore the mark of skilled craftsmanship. Whoever built this place had expected it to last. Ethan grabbed a flashlight from his toolbox and aimed the beam downward. The light disappeared into the darkness before finally revealing the lower steps, perhaps 15 feet below. The staircase curved gently out of sight. "That was not built by a poor man," Walter said quietly. Ethan nodded. Everything about the construction felt expensive. Intentional. Hidden. Ranger suddenly descended the first 2 steps before stopping and looking back toward Ethan. The dog seemed impatient now, as though the mystery that had been whispering beneath the floor for weeks was finally ready to speak. Ethan followed carefully. Each step released tiny clouds of dust that sparkled in the flashlight beam. The temperature dropped noticeably as they moved deeper underground. Above them, the sounds of wind and birds gradually faded until only silence remained. It was not an empty silence. It felt layered. Waiting. When Ethan reached the bottom, the beam of his flashlight swept across a stone corridor stretching ahead. The walls were lined with smooth concrete reinforced by steel supports. Everything looked far more sophisticated than a simple hidden cellar. Ranger moved forward slowly, ears raised. Walter arrived moments later, breathing heavily. Neither man spoke. Words somehow felt too small for what they were seeing. 20 yards ahead, the corridor opened into a large chamber. Ethan directed the flashlight across the room and stopped. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Wooden crates sat stacked in neat rows. A massive workbench occupied the center of the room. Every item remained exactly where it had been left, untouched by time. It looked less like a storage space and more like someone had simply stepped out and never returned. Then the flashlight landed on something hanging above the workbench. A calendar. The pages had yellowed with age, but one date remained clearly visible. October 14th, 1962. Walter's face drained of color. "That was the year Everett disappeared," he said softly. Ranger walked toward the far wall and suddenly stopped. His body became rigid once again. Ethan followed the direction of the dog's gaze. There, partially hidden behind a row of shelves, stood a second steel door unlike anything else in the chamber. Thick, reinforced, locked, and somehow far newer than everything around it. The steel door seemed out of place, as if it belonged to another era entirely. Everything else in the underground chamber carried the quiet weight of age. Dust rested on every shelf. The wooden crates wore the faded scars of decades. Yet the door stood clean and solid, its surface barely touched by rust. Ranger approached it slowly, his nails clicking softly against the concrete floor. The German shepherd stopped inches from the metal and tilted his head. Ethan had seen that expression before. It was the same look Ranger wore whenever he sensed something beyond ordinary explanation. Walter stepped closer, the beam from his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "That was never part of the stories," he whispered. Ethan examined the door. Carefully. There was no visible handle. No traditional lock. Only a circular metal plate mounted near the center. Strange symbols had been etched around its edge. Not symbols from another world. Just engineering marks. Measurements. Calculations. Notes left by a mind obsessed with precision. The kind of markings a builder might leave for himself. Ranger suddenly pawed at the floor directly beneath the plate. Ethan knelt and brushed away a layer of dust. Hidden in the concrete was a narrow groove leading from the wall to a small metal box mounted low near the floor. It had been concealed so well that nobody could have noticed it without knowing exactly where to look. He opened the box. Inside rested a brass lever. The metal remained surprisingly polished despite the years. Ethan exchanged a glance with Walter. Neither spoke. The silence felt sacred somehow, like standing inside a church built by an engineer instead of an architect. Slowly, Ethan pulled the lever. Somewhere deep within the walls, gears awakened. The sound rolled through the chamber like distant thunder beneath the earth. Ranger immediately backed away and sat down, watching intently. The circular plate on the door began to rotate. Not quickly, deliberately, as though some forgotten machine was remembering how to move. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Metal clicked against metal. Then the massive door released with a deep mechanical sigh. Cool air flowed outward. Different from the air in the chamber. Fresher somehow. Cleaner. Ethan directed his flashlight through the opening. What he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. Beyond the door was not another storage room. It was an entire underground workshop. Long rows of benches stretched into the distance. Shelves filled with tools lined the walls. Copper pipes ran across the ceiling. Massive flywheels stood motionless beside machines unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It looked as though an inventor had spent a lifetime building a hidden world beneath the Montana hills. Walter slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Good Lord," he whispered. Ranger moved forward first. The shepherd walked through the doorway with calm confidence, as though he had already known this place existed. Ethan followed. Every surface revealed new wonders. Detailed blueprints covered the walls. Journals sat neatly arranged on shelves. Mechanical models occupied display tables. Some appeared decades ahead of their time. Others were impossible to identify at all. Then Ethan noticed something unusual near the center of the workshop. A single desk illuminated by a shaft of sunlight entering through some unseen opening far above. On the desk rested a leather-bound journal. Unlike everything else in the room, it carried almost no dust, as if someone had expected it to be found. Ethan carefully opened the cover. On the first page, written in steady handwriting, was a message. To the person who finally opens this door, if you are reading this, then Ranger has done exactly what I hoped a good dog would do. Ethan froze. Walter stared. Slowly, both men looked toward the German shepherd. Ranger simply sat beside the desk, his amber eyes reflecting the light, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. The words seemed impossible. Ethan read the sentence again, slower this time, as if repetition might reveal a hidden explanation. To the person who finally opens this door, if you are reading this, then Ranger has done exactly what I hoped a good dog would do. Walter leaned over his shoulder, blinking in disbelief. "That cannot be possible," he murmured. Ethan felt the same confusion. Everett Hale had vanished in 1962. Ranger was only 6 years old. Yet somehow the inventor had written a message that felt directed toward the dog sitting calmly beside the desk. Ranger lifted his head and looked toward the far end of the workshop. The shepherd seemed less interested in the journal than in something still hidden beyond it. Ethan carefully turned the page. The handwriting remained neat and steady. "If you are here, then my greatest experiment survived. Not a machine, not a fortune, an idea." The next several pages revealed fragments of Everett's life. He had been an engineer, inventor, and dreamer who believed technology should serve ordinary people rather than corporations. During the 1950s, he had developed a series of energy systems capable of producing electricity with remarkable efficiency. According to his notes, several companies had attempted to buy his work. He refused every offer. He wanted his discoveries to remain available to small communities, farms, and families who could never afford expensive infrastructure. Ethan continued reading while Walter wandered slowly through the workshop. Every shelf seemed to contain evidence of decades of work. Detailed diagrams, prototype components, mathematical calculations written with obsessive precision. The deeper they explored, the more extraordinary the hidden world became. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why disappear? Ethan finally found the answer several pages later. The journal described increasing pressure from investors and business groups who wanted control of the inventions. Everett feared his life's work would disappear into private ownership. So he did something few people would ever consider. He vanished intentionally. He sealed his workshop. He buried his discoveries beneath the earth. Then he left clues that only time could uncover. A soft sound interrupted Ethan's thoughts. Ranger had moved again. The shepherd stood near the far wall, staring at a large blueprint mounted inside a glass frame. Ethan approached. At first the drawing looked like another technical design. Then he noticed something unusual. The blueprint was not showing a machine. It was a map. An underground map. Beneath Hollow Creek. Walter joined him, his eyes widening. Tunnels spread outward from the workshop in multiple directions. Some ended beneath open fields. Others beneath hillsides. One route extended nearly 3 miles toward the edge of town. Small handwritten notes filled the margins. Observation chambers. Storage vault. Water collection system. Emergency archive. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. The workshop was only part of something much larger. Ranger suddenly touched the lower corner of the frame with his nose. A faint click echoed through the room. Ethan stepped back immediately. Hidden mechanisms had already surprised them enough for one day. Slowly, The blueprint frame swung outward like a door. Behind it was a narrow compartment built into the wall. Inside rested a single metal tube sealed with wax. Ethan carefully removed it. Despite the decades, the seal remained intact. He broke it open and slid out a rolled document. The first line stopped him cold. If this document has been found, then the true archive still remains hidden. And what lies inside is worth far more than money. Ranger released a low whine and looked toward the darkness beyond the workshop, where another tunnel disappeared into the earth. Whatever secret Everett Hale had protected for more than 60 years, they had only just reached the beginning. The tunnel beyond the workshop seemed to absorb the light itself. Ethan folded the document carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket while Ranger stood at the entrance, waiting. The shepherd's ears were forward and alert, but there was no fear in his posture. Only purpose. Whatever instinct had led him beneath the shack was now pulling him deeper underground. Walter adjusted his flashlight and exhaled slowly. Part of me wants to walk back upstairs and pretend none of this exists. Ethan managed a faint smile. Too late for that. Together they followed Ranger into the tunnel. The passage was wider than Ethan expected, nearly 10 feet across in some places. Reinforced concrete walls stretched ahead with remarkable precision. Copper pipes followed the ceiling, disappearing into the darkness. Every few yards, faded electrical fixtures remained mounted along the walls. Most had long since stopped working, yet their presence hinted at the scale of Everett Hale's hidden vision. This was not a bunker. It was infrastructure. The tunnel gently sloped downward for nearly half a mile. The deeper they traveled, the cooler the air became. Occasionally they passed sealed doors marked with small brass plaques. Water systems. Archive 2. Mechanical storage. Each door remained locked. Each one suggested secrets waiting behind it. Ranger ignored them all. He never hesitated. He moved as though he knew exactly where he was going. Eventually, the tunnel widened into a vast underground chamber unlike anything they had seen before. Ethan stopped at the entrance and stared. The room stretched nearly the length of a football field. Towering shelves rose from floor to ceiling. Thousands of carefully organized boxes filled the space. Metal cabinets lined entire walls. Long tables supported stacks of rolled blueprints. It looked less like a hidden laboratory and more like a library built for the future. Walter slowly turned in a circle. "Good Lord," he whispered. "This man saved everything." Ethan walked to the nearest shelf and pulled out a folder. Inside were engineering plans for small hydroelectric generators designed to power isolated farms. Another contained water purification systems requiring almost no maintenance. A third described affordable heating technology capable of reducing fuel costs dramatically. The inventions were not designed to make someone rich. They were designed to help ordinary people live better lives. Suddenly, the true purpose of Everett's disappearance became clear. He had not hidden treasure. He had hidden solutions. Ranger barked once from across the chamber. Ethan hurried toward him. At the center of the room stood a large steel cabinet separated from the rest of the archive. Unlike everything else, it carried multiple locks. Above it hung a framed photograph. Ethan lifted his flashlight toward the image. The picture showed Everett Hale standing beside a younger German shepherd. The inventor smiled proudly while resting a hand on the dog's shoulder. Written beneath the photograph were 5 simple words. The first guardians always listen. Ethan felt a chill move through him. Ranger sat quietly beneath the picture. His amber eyes reflected the flashlight beam. The resemblance between the dogs was striking. Different generations. Same breed. Same intelligence. Same watchful expression. Walter noticed something else. "Look at the cabinet." Ethan stepped closer. One of the locks had already been opened. Not recently. Decades ago. He carefully pulled the door open. Inside rested a single wooden case. Unlike the documents surrounding it, this box appeared handcrafted. A brass plate on the lid carried a message. "For the town that forgot me." Ethan slowly opened the case. Inside were dozens of patent certificates, legal records, ownership documents, and letters from attorneys. His eyes widened as he read the first page. Everett Hale had never abandoned his inventions. He had legally protected them. Every patent, every design, every future royalty. The ownership remained active. And according to the final document resting on top, the rights now belonged to the legal owner of the property where the archive was discovered. Ethan stared silently at the papers while Walter's flashlight trembled. Somewhere above them, Hidden beneath miles of earth and decades of history, a forgotten shack stood quietly in the Montana hills. Neither man had yet realized that the true value of what they had found was about to change far more than one life. The discovery did not remain hidden for long. Within days, engineers, historians, attorneys, and patent specialists arrived in Hollow Creek from across the country. Pickup trucks filled the streets. News vans parked beside diners. People who had never heard of Everett Hale suddenly found themselves studying his name. Ethan watched it all from the porch of the shack as autumn winds swept across the hills. The same town that had laughed when he bought the property now stood at the center of a story nobody could fully explain. Ranger remained unfazed by the attention. He spent most mornings lying beside the porch steps, calmly observing the endless stream of visitors. Inside the underground archive, teams worked carefully through thousands of documents. Every day brought another revelation. Everett's inventions had not merely survived. Many had quietly influenced modern technologies through partnerships, licensing agreements, and dormant patents that remained legally active. The numbers grew larger with every review. Tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. One afternoon, Ethan sat inside the county courthouse listening as a team of attorneys explained the findings. The room fell silent when the lead attorney removed his glasses and placed a thick report on the table. According to their research, Everett Hale had created one of the most valuable privately held collections of engineering patents in the country. The ownership records were legitimate. The trusts were valid. The protections had remained intact for more than 60 years. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Ethan Callaway had become the legal beneficiary of assets worth more than $200 million. The words barely felt real. Ethan glanced through the courthouse window toward the mountains. For a moment, he remembered sleeping in his truck beside forgotten highways. He remembered cold nights, empty gas stations, and years spent believing that life had already passed him by. Yet none of those memories felt painful now. They felt necessary, as though every mile had quietly led him here. Outside, reporters crowded the steps. Town residents gathered in small groups discussing the news. Some were stunned. Others celebrated. But the greatest surprise came several days later when engineers completed their review of Everett's archive. The inventions themselves proved valuable, but the designs hidden within the collection held even greater potential. Affordable energy systems, water purification technologies, agricultural innovations, practical solutions capable of helping rural communities across America. Everett's final vision had survived exactly as he intended. One evening, as the sun settled behind the Montana hills, Ethan returned alone to the underground archive. Ranger walked beside him through the familiar tunnels. The great chamber stood silent once again. Shelves stretched endlessly into the shadows. History waited patiently in every corner. Ethan stopped beneath the photograph of Everett and the German Shepherd. The inventor's smile seemed strangely peaceful. Beneath the frame, Ethan noticed something he had missed before. A small folded note tucked into the corner. He carefully unfolded it. The paper carried only one sentence. Wealth was never the treasure. What you choose to do with it is. Ethan read the words twice. Then he looked down at Ranger. The shepherd gazed back calmly, his amber eyes reflecting the soft light. Somewhere above them, Hollow Creek prepared for a future nobody had imagined. And deep underground, among the inventions, dreams, and forgotten hopes of a man who had trusted time more than fame, Ethan finally understood that the greatest discovery was not hidden in the patents, the archives, or the fortune. It was the realization that one loyal dog had led him not to riches, but to purpose. Winter arrived gently in Hollow Creek that year. Snow settled across the hills like a clean white blanket, softening the edges of fences, rooftops, and forgotten roads. From the porch of the old shack, Ethan watched the morning light spread across the valley while Ranger rested beside him, his silver and cream coat glowing beneath the rising sun. Months had passed since the discovery beneath the property, yet the greatest changes could not be measured in dollars. The underground archive had become the foundation for something entirely new. Engineers, teachers, students, and researchers now visited Hollow Creek regularly. The old workshop remained preserved exactly as Everett Hale had left it, transformed into a public center dedicated to innovation and community service. The inventions hidden underground were being adapted to help small towns across the country. Affordable energy systems powered remote farms. Water purification designs improved rural infrastructure. The ideas Everett had protected for decades were finally reaching the people he had always hoped to serve. Ethan could have left. He could have purchased a mansion overlooking the ocean or disappeared into a life of comfort. Instead, he stayed. He restored the shack rather than replacing it. The weathered structure became a symbol of the story itself. School groups often visited, amazed that one of the most important discoveries in the region had begun beneath a floor that almost nobody valued. Walter Briggs became the unofficial historian of the project. Every Saturday, he told visitors stories about Hollow Creek, laughing whenever he reached the part where everyone had mocked the property at auction. Ranger became something of a local legend. Children drew pictures of him. Travelers stopped to take photographs beside the porch. Yet none of that seemed to matter to the German Shepherd. Every morning, he followed the same routine. A walk through the fields. A patrol around the property. Then, a quiet moment sitting beside the framed photograph of Everett and his dog inside the archive. Ethan often wondered if some connection existed beyond explanation. Perhaps loyalty recognized loyalty across generations. Perhaps some mysteries were never meant to be solved completely. One evening near Christmas, Ethan returned to the workshop after a community gathering. Snow drifted gently outside while warm lights glowed throughout the underground halls. He stopped beneath the photograph and noticed something he had never seen before. Behind the frame, hidden in the corner, rested a final envelope. Inside was a single handwritten page. The date at the top read October 1962. Everett's final entry. The words were simple. Someday a good person will find this place. Not because they are wealthy, brilliant, or important. They will find it because they listen, the same way a faithful dog listens. Ethan smiled as he folded the page and slipped it back into the envelope. Ranger sat beside him, watching quietly. For a long moment, neither moved. The workshop hummed softly with life above and below ground. Outside, snow continued falling across the Montana hills. Inside, a homeless veteran who once believed he had been forgotten finally understood something beautiful. The miracle had never been hidden beneath the shack. The miracle was that kindness, loyalty, and hope had been waiting there all along, patiently searching for someone willing to believe they still mattered.